Hey, it's Kley. Welcome to another video. Today, we're going to take a look at a amplifier schematic. Now, the main purpose of this is actually related to the Monoprice 15-watt tube amp that I just did a video on. This is going to be like a follow-up to that. I'm going to crack it open and take a look at it. But before I do that, I want to do a deep look at the schematic. Now, this schematic actually comes from the Laney Cub 12. But someone on the internet, who knows if they're right or wrong, said that they believed that the Monoprice, or the Harley Benton, or whatever it is called in your country, is a direct clone and copy of that Laney amp. So this schematic comes from the Laney 12R service manual, and it's the best schematic I've seen. Now, I've actually already done the analysis. I'm doing this at the end, even though you're seeing this at the beginning. And in analyzing this schematic, I do believe that it very, very closely matches what we see in the Monoprice, but I can't really confirm or deny yet if it's actually accurate. So if for nothing else, this will be an interesting analysis at an amplifier schematic. I'm going to walk through it and see what's all happening and maybe give some suggestions for modifications that I might consider making. And so let's go ahead and dive into that. All right, let's take a look at the schematic here. Now, I want to make you guys aware that I'm not 100% certain at this time if this schematic actually matches the Monoprice 15-watt tube amp that I have. We're going to figure that out more or less in a little bit after I open it up. But before I did that, I did a little bit of homework, and in Googling and looking at forum posts on the internet, it appeared that the internet consensus is that this Monoprice amp is more or less a clone of the Laney Cub 15 or 12? Laney Cub 12? Yeah, 12R. And Laney releases a service manual that has a schematic. So I found this schematic. I believe that this is pretty close. I have looked at it, and it does seem to share almost entirely similar characteristics. From the outside, I know that there are two EL84 power tubes, three 12AX7 preamp tubes, and I know that, I have every reason to believe that this thing is very similar to that. So, very possible that I could be wrong, but for now, this is what we're going to go with. And I've got the schematic here. Now, the schematic is kind of hard to look at, so I've broken it into different sections, and then I can draw on it if I want. So let's just go ahead and take a look first at the power supply. Now, we've got the mains coming in here. We've got a fuse. We've got a main switch that's switching both sides of the 120 volts, both the live and the neutral, and then it's going into the primary side of this power transformer. Now, the power transformer then goes into this clip. There, I haven't seen the models anywhere listed other than it's number 6094. Yeah, so I guess I'm not 100% sure what exactly model of transformer it is. But the secondary side, the high voltage, is going to come out right here. We've got diode rectification right in this area. Now, there are some capacitors, some very small valued capacitors here. I'm guessing these are just to help with like circuit protection or popping or things like that. I'm actually not 100% sure what these capacitors all do. But I do know that right here we've got a 300 volts coming out of this diode rectification to give us our high voltage B+. We've got a hum adjust pot here. I think that's probably for the heaters. We've got some other lines in here, I think probably to drive the relays, would be my guess, especially this 15 volt line. But and then there's also a bias tap here that's going to provide our negative DC voltage to bias the output tubes. So this power supply looks great. I don't have any complaints with it. I think it all looks fantastic. I'm going to go to the preamp next, and then we're going to walk our way through the audio signal, how it goes through the amplifier. Now, on my amp, I also have two input jacks, but it also appears that a later version just has one input jack, and then it has like a switch. Now, the way they've kind of done this, and the way is basically the signal, both the high and the low, goes into this first relay switch. Now, they've got the circuitry to power the relay switches here. They're listed as like HD1, HD10. To be real honest, I don't fully understand what these symbols mean or how the relay switch all works. So there are other times where we'll see the relay switching, and it's possible I may get some of that stuff wrong, but I'm just going to assume a couple of things. First of all, that the high input just basically goes straight into this point in the circuit where you've got, okay, so zooming in, you can see the signal here from the high input, I believe, comes in on this line. So when it comes to this first junction point, this is really the first time we see some circuitry. We've got this 1 mega ohm. I would call this like a grid leak resistor. It helps set the input impedance of the amplifier and is completely standard. We've also got a 68K grid stopping resistor here, and then the signal goes into the grid of this first 12AX7 or ECC83 triode stage. Now 68K, this grid stopping resistor, most Fender amps will have like two 68Ks in parallel, which will make 34K. I mean, as long as you have something here, like that's maybe 10K, all the way up to, I don't know if I'd go much higher than 68K. That's just going to help. And what it does is it actually works with the capacitance in the tube. There's a thing called the Miller effect. So which that basically means is that the tube has kind of some inherent capacitance. So if you think about it, you've got a resistor here and then a capacitance to ground, and all of that capacitance is going to work with this 68K resistor, and it's basically going to form a very, very high frequency, low pass filter. So it's going to help remove high frequency isolations, and you actually want to set it so that it's like, at 15K or 20K. Your guitar signal is not going to be functional beyond 15 or 20K anyways, and so you want to remove all that here at the input to help stabilize and clean things up perfectly normal and fine. Next, we've got a 2.2K bias resistor and then a 680 nanofarad bypass cap. So 2.2K is perfectly fine. 1.5K is usually a little more of like a center bias resistor. So if you think about if this is 0 and your sine wave, your guitar signal is doing this, the center bias means that this center point is there. You have just as much above as you do below the line. If you make it 2.2K, you're ever so slightly shifting it. So if this is your sine wave, if this is center bias, you're ever so slightly shifting it down so that the negative waveforms will clip just ever so slightly sooner than the positive waveforms, which will introduce some asymmetrical distortion. We'll get more into that over here, but no real problem with that. I do like to experiment a little bit with these values of these cathode bias resistors, but 2.2K is still a pretty standard and adequate value. Going up here to the plate, so the signal comes into the grid, gets amplified, and you've got the heaters down here shooting up electrons, and then the high plate voltage draws them up like a vacuum to the plate. So now the plate, we've got this 100K load resistor up here. The 100K helps to set the load line, very completely standard. So this whole gain stage right in here is just very, very typical standard. Really nothing that I would look at to make any meaningful changes. You can maybe tweak this value a little bit, this value, just to taste or to flavor. One comment I didn't mention, though, with this cathode bypass cap, the value of that capacitor will, if you make it a smaller capacitor, it will prevent some low frequencies from passing through. So, for example, if you have like a 25 microfarads, that's basically full frequency. All of your frequencies are going to pass through. But this 680 nanofarads being smaller than that means just a little bit of your bass frequencies are getting trimmed, which I actually really like, especially if it's an amp that you're going to maybe plan on having it create some distortion. I think a little bit of bass tightening here at the input is smart. So I like that decision. You could go with something bigger, especially if you wanted more of like a full piano-bodied, low-frequency tone. Maybe the 25 microfarads to let all those bass in at this time would be good, but I like those decisions. So then after the signal comes through to the plate, it runs into these two capacitors here. They serve to help block DC voltage. You've got this high voltage DC right up here coming down, and you can see we've got 220 volts. This is our B plus rail right here. So we've got a filter cap, 22 microfarads. We've got a 10K resistor there dropping, another filter cap. All this is just very standard here on your B plus rail. But then you've got these DC blocking caps right here, 2.2 nanofarads. It's fine. Looks like there's another one. I don't know if they meant to do 2 in series, which maybe would, I don't remember off the top of my head if it doubles or halves the value. I could be wrong. But I personally, when I would build an amp, I wouldn't put 2 caps here, but there's also this relay, which again, I don't really understand what exactly it's doing or why they would do the relay there. It doesn't seem to me that there's any real switching going on. Maybe this is part of this input stuff. Maybe if you plug into the high input, it uses one of these paths and not the other. I'm not 100% sure about that though. So I'm just going to pretend though that the audio signal goes in here. We've got a 220K resistor. We've got a gain pot at 100K and then a 2.2K. Now these three, the resistor here, and this pot help to set your preamp gain. So this is how much distortion, the signal comes in here, gets amplified, gets made bigger, and how much of that signal gets pumped down here to ground versus how much is allowed to continue on ultimately towards that next gain stage. So by putting a little bit of resistance here and here, what you're basically doing is preforming a little bit of a voltage divider, and then the pot also gives you kind of further fine-tuning control of that. You could just put a pot, but that means you would get the full sweep, whereas putting these additional resistors fundamentally just changes how the sweep of the pot. So it's like how much distortion do you get on 0 versus on 10, and how quickly does it sweep through the range of that distortion. The way you set up these resistors in this pot affects that. I would also note there's a 330K resistor here and then this 100 picofarad cap. What this means is if your gain control is like if it's down here, meaning it's like set low, like 2 or 3, then a lot of the signal is encouraged to go this way. Now 330K is going to slow this down. So it's basically going to negate some of the effect, but this 100 picofarads is going to allow very, very high frequencies to pass the gain control. So it's like a bright cap that's hardwired into the amp. Now, I like the 330K resistor. It basically means that the bright cap is less harsh and less effective. With bright caps, when the gain pot is all the way on max, meaning like none of the resistance is involved, then the cap doesn't need to do anything because the signal can just flow freely and there is nothing to bypass because nothing is being shunted to ground. Whereas if you set the gain low, then some of that signal those very high frequencies as selected by the 100 picofarads will be allowed to pass through, and it'll just make the amp brighter, maybe harsher. I personally am not a huge fan of bright caps, but this implementation with this resistor I actually kind of enjoy. So probably would leave it as is. Now, I'm not sure why there's this 1 meg pot down here with a cap to ground, and it's kind of got this cap coming back in. I don't, I really don't fully understand what is going on with these components here, so I'm just going to ignore them. Sorry. We've got another 22 nanofarad cap and then 1 meg resistor. Now these, as I look at it, would potentially, we've already got our DC blocking caps. We don't need that. So I think this 22 nanos in this 1 meg would form a filter, a CR capacitor resistor filter, which if my memory serves me correctly, let's look over here at our tone stack. Yeah, it'd be like a treble control. So I think you are getting a little bit of very high frequency being shunted to ground here. So you've got a little bit of bass cut here, a little bit of treble boost here, a little bit of treble cut here. So some subtle choices are being made to tweak the tone a little bit. Next, we come to this second gain stage. This is V1. It says V1A. I don't. In my mind, the first gain stage should be V1A, and then this should be V1B. But whatever. So I'm just going to call it the second gain stage. Another ECC83 or 12AX7. Now, the interesting component, we've got 100K on the plate, but the real interesting one is this 10K on the cathode, and there is no bypass cap. This is a cold clipper. So if you're familiar with the Marshall JCM 800 circuit, that circuit uses this to great effect. Referring back to our waveform, the 10K means if this is center bias, 10K is going to set it down here. So these negative waveforms are going to clip almost immediately. They almost have no room to swing, and then the positive can swing quite a lot. So again, you're getting an asymmetrical distortion. The positive waveforms are being amplified and swinging freely. The bottom negative waveforms are being clipped immediately and clipped heavily. So, this is a very interesting tonal choice and definitely puts it clearly in the Marshall kind of British crunch type camp. Now, this would definitely also be a spot to consider some potential modifications. You could copy this or something similar to it, or like on a Fender amp, you could do like a 1.5K and then put a cap on, bypassing it like a 25 microfarads, and you would get more gain. And by gain, I mean like signal amplification, but you would get less clipping and less asymmetrical clipping. So you basically be changing the flavor of the distortion to be less of this British JCM 800 asymmetrical thing and more of the center biased Fender thing. I might experiment with this. JCM 800 is not an amp that I have built before, but I have experimented with cold clippers, and I don't know if that's always the sound that I am personally looking for, so might experiment with that a little bit. Got another DC blocking 22 nanofarad cap here. That's fine. The value of these caps you can experiment with. If you use a larger value like a 0.1, you're going to let more bass through, but if you use a smaller value like 22 or 2 nanofarads, it's going to trim a little bit of bass. I am always a fan of a little bit of trimming, but the values are fine. I have no problem with that. Next, we come here. This is a simple voltage divider. Signal comes into this 470K resistor and then a 470K resistor to ground. So that really, this is just very, with these two values, you can very clearly see it's a 50% volume cut. So you can imagine right here, there's a volume control that's preset at half to only allow half of the signal to continue this way. If you wanted to experiment with this, you could take these resistors out and put a pot in their place, so like a 1 meg pot. You could also change their values, which would change the amount of signal being bled to ground, like the ratio. Right now it's a 50-50. You could change that. If you put more resistance on the ground side than the high side, you increase the signal, and vice versa. Let's say you make this like 600K and this 200K, then you actually make the amp cleaner. So this would be an interesting spot. This R41 and R45, these resistors could be changed to change the amount of gain in the amp. So for example, if you did what I said here, and you did the like 1.5K bias with the cathode bypass cap, you're going to increase your amount of signal gain. And then if you take these resistors out, maybe put a pot. Now, I do kind of like having a resistor here that can function as like a grid leaking resistor. But I do think these resistors are an interesting place that you could experiment and change the amount of signal amplification you're getting from these three gain stages, either pushing the amp to be cleaner, more of like a, I'm going to say more of like a voxy, even though you've got three gain stages up till this point, you could make it cleaner by dumping more signal to ground, or you could even go in the opposite direction. Like I said, do the, get rid of this signal being dumped to ground and increase the gain. So here and here are probably the two spots so far where I would personally look to maybe make some tonal changes to your preference. Next, another gain stage. This is V2, 100K on the plate is fine, 820 ohms. This is basically the opposite of this 10K. This is a very warm bias resistor, and again, no cap. So you could put a bypass cap, you could change this value. I'd be kind of curious, to see what this amp would sound like if you had 1.5K bias resistors, 25 microfarad cathode bypass caps in all three of these spots. That would be kind of an intriguing change to me. The bypass caps here and here are going to increase signal gain, and so at higher gain levels, you would get more distortion. Maybe even putting another pot here would be kind of intriguing to me. That way you could crank this gain, get more distortion than what you have available now. Okay, now we get to the tail end here of this preamp circuit, and the biggest thing to note here is we've got a very Marshall or Bassman style cathode follower. So our signal gets amplified here. We run into the grid of this last triode number 4. Now this one doesn't have a plate resistor to set the load line because the signal is actually coming out of the cathode, which instead of amplifying it as a voltage amplifier, it instead becomes more of gives it more of a current boost. So while the signal is not being amplified, it's basically running out of this cathode follower, which will boost its current and its ability to run through this tone stack is fundamentally what's happening here. And so we run into a tone stack. Now this, looking just briefly at this tone stack, here's our treble control, this 470 picofarad cap and 220K pot, perfectly fine. We've got our slope resistor here, 33K, 22 nanofarads base and middle, and then we've got 1 meg base pot, 22K middle pot. So, I mean, this tone stack to me screams like a Marshall Plexi. This whole setup right here is basically taken straight out of a Marshall, where you've got the tone stack at the end of this preamp. Now, having played a lot of different amps, if you the location of the tone stack in a preamp is really important. If you stick it over here, like where it would be in like a Fender style amp, then what you're really doing here is you're changing the EQ at this stage, but you've got more gain stages that are going to come afterwards. And so some of that EQ tone shaping can actually kind of be diminished, and instead there could be distortion or clipping that happens later down the line. And so, the way I would think about it is like it becomes more of a tone or a character type tone shaping, whereas so to flesh that out, let's say you have a lot of bass frequencies, you throw treble to ground and you boost a lot of bass at this input stage. Well, it's going to get amplified and amplified. All those bass frequencies are going to get the amp real fuzzy, real spongy, real loose. On the flip side, if you boost more of the treble stuff, it's going to be more biting. You're basically sending more frequencies that are going to be distorted. Whereas here, at the very end of the preamp, all the amplification and gain and distortion has already been generated and structured, and all you're really doing is shaping the final EQ, just more of like a pure surgical EQ, almost like in post-production of a mix in a DAW. So you've got treble, middle, bass, and a volume. One thing you could potentially do is take this ground control and put it on a switch so that the tone stack can be bypassed. Tone stacks place a very heavy load on an audio signal, but I think it's pretty valuable to have it. I'm really glad it's there. So let's go to the output section next. Okay, so here's our output section. We come into here. Now, I haven't spent a ton of time looking at this stage, so I'm just going to comment kind of more generally and not comment specifically on all the little component values that if you wanted to mess around with, you certainly could. But basically what we're looking at here is a long tail pair phase inverter where we've got these two stages here. The signal comes in here and then exits out let's see here, breaks off here to go into each of these grids. They come out of each of the plates. Okay, what we're looking at here is a long tail pair phase inverter. Our 12AX7 is split into two triodes. Our audio signal comes in, goes into this first gain stage, and then takes this capacitor here towards the output tube. Then the grid is fed here through these resistors to this other output, or the other side of this triode goes up through this cathode into here. All this is just kind of a very straightforward long tail pair phase inverter. And again, I haven't really looked or will comment on the individual specific values or how it would compare contrast with a Plexi or a Fender Deluxe Reverb or something like that. But I'm sure there are a lot of little devices or little component values that could be changed to mimic that a little bit more. But it all looks pretty good to me. The only other comment I do really want to make, though, is right in here. Now, one of the mysteries I was trying to figure out is what exactly is the inputs. Like, you've got the 1 watt input, and I think that what it's doing is you've got this VR3, and the way this is set up is it's like a Type 2 mass post phase inverter master volume. So I think what's happening here is you've got this relay here. And I think what's happening is when you go into, let's bring up our preamp again. When you go in here, if you're in the high input, then it bypasses this and it just goes through these decoupling caps and then here to the power tubes. And then same thing right here. But if you plug into the 1 watt mode, it flips the relay, and then instead you go this way. One goes in here, one goes in here, and then it runs into this post phase inverter master volume. So I believe what's happening is instead of it being a 1 watt mode, when I think of 1 watt, to me that would mean that the voltage rail, the B plus, is being affected in some way. The power, the high voltage that's being used in the amp is being changed. But that's not really what's happening. It's just a post phase inverter master volume, which is really kind of a curious and interesting way of, I'm not saying I'm trying to be critical of why they call it a 1 watt mode, because it really isn't, but it kind of acts like that, and it is a useful tone shaping tool. So one thing you could potentially do is try to find this VR3. I don't know if this is like a trim pod in the amp, but you could put this on a actual 250K linear pot and stick it on the child or chassis of the amp. And then you could have total control over, when you're in the 1 watt mode, you basically would have this master volume. And you could even use an AB switch on the front end to go between the two to give you varying levels of post-phase inverter master volume. That would be kind of interesting. Then we do go into here, and here are 2 EL84 power tubes. Now, the biggest thing I would note about them is we have a bias line in here, which is providing our negative DC voltage, which is going to go into the grids, try to have the grids negative. And then if you look here at the cathodes, they are tied together and set to ground. So, yeah, pretty straightforward. You have fixed bias. Adjustable fixed bias is how I would describe this. Very similar to a deluxe reverb, just using EL84s. So, yeah, you've got some diodes here on the plate to ground, I think probably for signal protection. And then they come back together here in your output transformer. The only other comment I want to make about that is, here's our output transformer. We also have this R22 47K. This is a negative feedback resistor. So you've got right here, this is all happening on the positive terminal of the loudspeaker. And if we follow this back this way, you can see it ties back in here. Now, I think maybe is providing a little bit of tone shaping, you almost think of it like a presence control. So one thing you could potentially look to do is interrupt this and put it on a switch. I think that would be an interesting thing to do. And all in all, yeah, I really like playing around with negative feedback. I think it's a really fun thing to play around with. So, yeah. Now let's review. Other than this switch here, let's talk a little bit about what preamp tone mods. I would put a switch in here. I think that would be a good mod. But then let's go back to our preamp. Okay, so what are some of the mods that you could make? Well, I kind of highlighted them. I talked a little bit about this one. You could change that, but I don't think that would have much change on the tone. The main things that I would be looking at are these components that I've highlighted in orange. So specifically, this first gain stage, the value of this cap, if you want it to be full frequency, you could do 25 UF, change this to 1.5K to get, full, kind of a quote-unquote full frequency boost. Changing this 10K cathode, this is our cold clipping resistor, and then also this 820 ohms. One thing I would be very curious about would be to see all three of these be a 1.5K and with a full bypass cap, 25 microfarads. I would be curious about what that would sound like. By adding cathode bypass caps to this in this stage, you're going to have more signal gain, which I think would be kind of interesting. It could potentially even make the amp higher gain, but also like change the tonality of the distortion. You'd have less of this cold clipping 10K thing and more of a full frequency distortion. I'd be kind of curious to see what that would sound like. And then second of all, changing these two resistors and making them into maybe a pot, maybe a 1 meg pot, so you have gain 1, gain 2. You think about it, there's already a gain 2 pot just hardwired in here. And it's probably good to have a little bit of signal going to ground just for stability in the amp, but I also like to have a little bit of control over things. Maybe you could put the middle ground pot on a switch, but I wouldn't really make a lot of changes to the tone stack, so you certainly could. If you were unhappy with the way the EQ controls were working, that would be a good spot to look at it. But really between the negative feedback switch and these kind of gain stage changes, I actually think that the structure of this amp is really quite good. Having 1, 2, 3 gain stages into the long tail pair phase inverter, that's really 4 gain stages. This is definitely a smoking little amp capable of some gain and can clip the signal. So I would embrace it and just go headlong into that. I don't know if I would want to look to make this amp a super squeaky clean, high headroom type thing. To me, I think it's most fun to be in that realm. So those are probably the mods that I would do. Obvious other mods would be like tube swaps or speaker. The speaker swap would be a huge opportunity as well. But overall, the schematic of this circuit is really well thought out, and I like it, and probably will open mine up, confirm whether that's what we're looking at. So that'll be the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and we'll see you again real soon. Bye.